So I'm Cordelia Fine from the History and Philosophy program at the University of Melbourne, and this podcast is largely based on a paper that was co-authored with neuroscientist Professor Daphne Yuel from Tel Aviv University and Professor Jean Rippon from Aston University. Although, as you can see here, you get an extra thing if you look at the actual paper, and some of the material that's in this podcast isn't in the paper, and vice versa. So claims about sex differences in the brain and what they mean for how men and women and boys and girls think, feel and behave are everywhere. So they're not just in scientific papers, but they're also in popular books, in newspaper articles, in diversity and inclusion consultancy websites, even a Hollywood movie. Now, while there are potentially important and interesting discoveries to be made from investigating sex and the brain, particularly with respect to understanding why some psychopathologies of brain and mind are seen in one sex more than the other, this is really a surprisingly complex area, particularly when humans are involved. And over the course of 10 or 11 years of working in this area, I've seen how easily claims about sex differences in the brain are prematurely accepted as fact, overinterpreted, misinterpreted, occasionally apparently fabricated, or even transformed into grade A drivel. So here are 7 things to know and ask to protect against falling prey to the next myth that comes up about sex and the brain. So the first, perhaps the most fundamental question to ask when you encounter a report of a sex difference in the brain is, does that difference really exist? And to illustrate the importance of this question with a concrete example, I'm going to take you back to 1995, which saw the publication of a functional neuroimaging study published in the prestigious scientific journal Nature. This article, Sex Differences in the Functional Organisation of the Brain for Language. Now, you might think from the title of the paper that this means that there are sex differences in the functional organisation of the brain for language, but it's actually a bit more complicated than that. Now, most people intuitively recognise that all else being equal, when a study has a smaller sample size, we should have less confidence that it's a true result rather than a false positive or chance finding. And this particular study involved just 19 men and 19 women. And second, while the problem of false positives is an issue in all of behavioural science and beyond, and I'm sure many people listening will be aware of what's been sometimes referred to as the replication crisis in behavioural science and beyond, the problem of false positives is a particularly acute issue when it comes to sex differences. And this is because it's so easy and intuitive for researchers to sort of look for sex differences in their data, even when it's not a core part of their research program. And then any findings of difference may well get reported and emphasised, while findings of no differences may get tucked away in the results section or not be reported at all. And in fact, this study here, the Shaywitz study, is a good illustration of this emphasis on difference over similarity. So in this study, the researchers used 3 different language tasks, and for 2 of the 3 tasks, there were no sex differences in brain activity. So researchers only found a sex difference in one task, and they found that brain activity in the language areas tended to be greater on the left side of the brain than the right side in men, but distributed more equally in women. To use the technical expression, brain activity was more lateralized in males. But note how the title emphasizes the one finding of sex difference rather than the 2 findings of sex similarity. So should we trust the finding of a difference? Now, some would say that the best way to investigate the reliability of a particular result is to conduct a statistical review of the entire relevant scientific literature or a meta-analysis. And as it happens, this has been done for sex differences in language lateralization using a collated sample of more than 2,000 participants. And this graph, this is work led by Iris Sommer and colleagues, shows the results of this meta-analysis. So down the left-hand side of the slide, you can see the name of each relevant study, together with the result for that study, which is weighted by the sample size due to larger samples being more reliable than smaller ones. Now you can see how much variability there is in the smaller study. So just to explain what's going on in the right-hand side of this figure, when you have a square over to the left side, that's larger asymmetry in females or greater lateralization in females, over to the right side, that means greater lateralization in males. So you can see that these small squares are kind of appearing on either side of that central 0 point. But you can see that the larger studies, one with the large squares, are actually much more consistent. And overall, this meta-analysis found no sex differences in language lateralization. So that's just highlighting that overall finding there. Now, this is quite an old example, and the behavioural science community has started to pay much more attention to the problem of excessive numbers of chance results. But for the time being, this is a live concern. And in fact, a study published last year analysed all functional neuroimaging studies of sex differences published over a 10-year period, and found that in contrast to what would be expected according to statistical theory, the few studies with large samples were no more likely to identify sex differences in brain activation than the many studies with small samples. And you can see that in that graph at the bottom there. You would expect to see a nice kind of correlation or association between the size of the sample and the number of regions of the brain where differences were found. That they didn't find this led the authors to conclude that this is a red flag for publication bias in this literature. So with regard to our first question, does a difference really exist? Some important questions to ask. How big was the sample? How many comparisons were made? How many of those comparisons showed differences and how many found similarities? Have the results been replicated in another sample? And how consistent are the findings with other studies? So moving on to the second question, how big is the difference? So suppose you're confident that you're talking about a real difference. The second important question to ask is, well, how big is that difference? Now, here's a kind of typical claim in a popular book about sex differences. This is Results at the Top, which is targeted at business leaders. This book describes the difference in average tendencies and how men and women think and act as huge, with only about 20% overlap. And you'll note in this little excerpt from the book that they attribute these differences to hardwired differences in brains and hormones, which is a point we'll come back to later. Now, I'm not sure where the authors sourced this claim, because literally no scientific study of sex differences in behaviour has ever reported a sex difference in behaviour this large, assuming that we're not talking about something like gender identity or sexual orientation. So, for example, a well-known review of meta-analyses of sex differences in cognition, communication, social and personality variables, psychological well-being, motor behaviours, and morality-related variables found that 30% of the time the overlap was like this top graph here. So you can see, if you imagine this was the distributions of males and females, you can see that there's a huge amount of overlap between males and females. A further 48% of the differences looked something like the middle graph, and a further 15% looked more like the bottom graph. So the largest differences in Hyde's review were for motor skills like throwing distance and velocity, for masturbation and attitudes towards casual sex, and obviously none of these are hopefully too relevant in the modern workplace. But even these differences actually don't come close to the huge male-female differences claimed by the results at the top authors. So it is, this is just to reiterate the point that it is easy for differences to be grossly exaggerated. Similarly, when it comes to the brain, even the largest sex differences come nowhere near close to the kind of separation indicated in that graph. So the 10 largest human sex differences in brain structure, as measured with magnetic resonance imaging, all fall within the range of overlap seen on these two graphs. And just to reiterate, we're talking about the 10 largest sex differences in the brain that were identified. So the second important set of questions to ask is, how big is the difference? So how much overlap is there between the male and female distributions? And it's important to point out that with very large samples, even very, very small differences that are in practical terms or in functional terms meaningless can be statistically significant. So once you're confident that a reported sex difference is a real difference, you've done a bit of a fact check on it. So here, for example, is the front page of The Independent reporting a finding of sex differences in brain connectivity And notice the headline, which is "Scientists discover the difference between male and female brains." The implication here is that the scientists' findings can be extrapolated from this particular sample, which was a big one, to all. So they found the difference. It's timeless, it's universal, and it's immutable. But is this a reasonable assumption? So it's important to point out that in the brain doesn't mean fixed and inevitable. So, for example, a survey of human sex differences in brain structure in 4 large data sets by Daphne Uel and colleagues found that the differences that made it into the top 10, the top 10 largest differences, actually depended on the data set. Even in non-human animals, factors like stress and housing conditions can affect the existence or nature of sex differences in the brain. So sex differences seen in some circumstances can disappear or even reverse in different conditions. And this can be the case for behaviour too, that circumstances can matter. So, for example, the dynamics of sexual behaviour in rhesus monkeys, including the influence of female hormonal state, varies according to how much space the monkeys have to interact. So, a third important set of questions to ask is, did the investigators test samples under different environmental conditions? If not, beware assumptions that the difference is stable and fixed. It may depend on environmental factors. And if the study was with humans, have the researchers tested to see whether the same differences are observed in other populations? So you're confident that a sex-gender difference in the brain or behaviour is real, and you've thought about its size and its kind, that it's big, it's small, it's stable, or it's fixed, or it's variable and contingent. So the next question to ask is, where did that difference come from? Now, in this op-ed for the LA Times, titled "The Futility of Gender-Neutral Parenting," journalist Deborah So writes that a large and long-standing body of research literature shows that toy preferences, for example, are innate, not socially constructed or shaped by parental feedback. And as part of her case, So refers to studies of girls who are exposed to high levels of testosterone prenatally, in the case of a genetic condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, or CAH. This is a quote from So. Girls with CAH tend to be gender non-conforming and will prefer toys that are typical to boys, even when their parents offer more praise for playing with female typical ones. This speaks to the vital role of hormones in developing gender preferences and sex differences in behaviour more broadly. So's interpretation of these findings, which is a standard one, reflects an assumption that whenever brains and hormones are involved, sex differences are due at least in part to a direct path from biological sex to brain and behaviour. And this is a diagram from an article by Daphne Uel and Margaret McCarthy, and you can see that direct effect. So we have our biological components of sex here, we have our chromosomes and our hormones, and you can see this idea of direct effects from these biological components of sex onto the behavioural endpoint, so whether that's brain or behaviour. But the pathway here can also be indirect. So we can see here that sex can make a difference to physiological features, which in turn may influence the environment that the individual encounters or is exposed to. Now, one example of indirect effects on sex is the sex difference in the number of motor neurons in a nucleus of the lumbar-spinal cord in the rat. Now, this sex difference in the brain actually partly depends on greater anogenital licking of rat dams of their male as opposed to their female pups. So anogenital licking is just a sort of normal maternal behaviour as part of the care of the mother for the pups. So why do the mothers lick the males more? Well, it turns out it's because they're attracted by the higher level of testosterone in the urine of the male pups. In other words, a facet of biological sex, differences in testosterone excretion by the pups, creates a, so to say, gendered environment that in turn affects brain development in a part of the brain associated with masculine sexual behaviour. And in humans, of course, we have gender, the socially constructed expectations concerning the roles, identities and behaviours associated with being either male or female. And intriguingly, it's possible that sex-related hormones may actually act by making us more susceptible to such gendering effects. So normally both boys and girls are strongly influenced by gender modelling and gender labelling. So if you tell boys and girls that this kind of toy that they've never seen before is for boys, then boys will be more interested. If you tell them it's for girls, they'll be more interested in it. Children are also kind of aware and responsive to those non-verbal gender cues like colour and symbol. And it turns out that the girls to whom So refers in her op-ed, who are exposed to atypically high levels of androgens during pregnancy, are actually much less influenced by gender modelling and labelling. And this is what this graph here is showing. In other words, their gender nonconformity may have less to do with direct effects of prenatal testosterone in the brain and more to do with indirect effects on gender socialisation. So this graph here is showing work led by Melissa Hines and colleagues at Cambridge University. And what you can see is the dark bars are showing, did the children remember what was modelled and labelled as being for girls and for boys? Yes, they do, to the same degree. But those lighter blue bars are showing to what extent did they show a preference for objects that were labelled or modelled as being for a child of their gender. And what you can see is that the girls with CAH are much less influenced by this labelling and modelling than the other children. So the fourth important question to ask is, did the researchers take account of possible indirect effects of sex, including the effects of gendered experiences on brain or hormones? So to recap, at the over the halfway mark, we've asked whether a sex difference is real, and we've thought about its size, its kind, and its origin. The next question to ask is, how does it fit in with other differences, or how does it all add up? Now, some of you may have read about this study of self-reported empathizing and systemizing, which was published last year. And it's intuitive to assume that empathizing and systemizing represent kind of polar opposites of the kind of brain that one has. So in fact, there's a reference to this idea of the extreme male brain theory of autism, which is a brain that's very good at systemizing and very poor at empathizing. So the assumption here is that the better honed your brain is for systemizing, the less good it will be at empathizing, and vice versa. And in fact, a colleague of mine who took the empathizing, systemizing test some years ago to find out whether he had a female brain or a male brain, dolefully reported to me afterwards that he scored rather low on both sets of questionnaires, and as a result he concluded that apparently he had no brain at all. But a bit more technically, his results on the test reflect the fact that there is actually only a very weak relationship between self-reported empathizing and self-reported systemizing. In other words, a high empathizing score can go alongside a high systemizing score, and as my colleague discovered, you can also score low on both. In other words, instead of neatly lining up on a single continuum, as in the sort of left-hand set of arrows here, people can actually be scattered around the four quadrants of 2 dimensions. And I haven't actually used pink and blue here, the stereotypical colours pink and blue, just to remind me to point out that the degree of overlap in sex differences in empathizing and systemizing is very large. So the degree of overlap here for these kinds of measures is substantial, and it's also worth pointing out that these are self-report questionnaires, so they're not directly measuring behaviour. So you can see that if things are this complex with just 2 variables, what happens when you consider lots of variables? And the short answer is that things quickly get a lot more complicated. So for both brain and behaviour, sex differences have been described as mixing up rather than adding up, and this is work by Daphne Joel and colleagues. This figure represents brain characteristics in men and women that are colour-coded according to whether particular regions were more male-typical or female-typical. And what you can see from the figure is that while women's brains have more female-typical characteristics overall, and men's brains have more male-typical ones, most brains are comprised of unique mosaics of male-typical and female-typical features. And the same goes for behaviour, as this graph shows. And again, these are drawing on the largest sex differences in behaviour that were identified, and on the right-hand side in particular, strongly sex stereotyped kinds of behaviours. Now, the argument here is that it's hard to know what's meant by talking about the male brain or male nature, or the female brain or female nature, unless you're referring to the very small number of individuals who only have characteristics of one type, and in fact may not be male or female, may actually be sort of counter-stereotypical. And I should say here that it is possible to create algorithms that can classify brains from a data set as belonging to men or women with a high degree of accuracy. However, this classification doesn't appear to capture biologically meaningful similarities between brains classified as belonging to the same category, and algorithms developed with one data set have lower success rates when used on other kinds of data sets. Another important point to make about how sex differences add up is that some biological sex differences serve to compensate for or cancel out other differences. And while this might seem a bit unintuitive, in many species, including our own, males and females often behave in quite similar ways despite physiological and chemical differences. For example, both male and female prairie voles, a type of rodent, show quite similar parenting behaviour, and this appears to be not just despite but because of sex differences in the brain and hormones. So in males but not in females, parental behaviour depends on a brain pathway that is much denser than in females, and this seems to be a compensation for the fact that, unlike females, males do not experience the physiological, for example hormonal, and behavioural changes associated with pregnancy. Now in humans, some neural differences may in fact be compensations for the average sex difference in brain size. For example, the press release of the study that led to that front page independent coverage that I showed you earlier reported striking differences in the neural wiring of men and women. Yet not only was this a classic case of an emphasis on islands of relatively small differences in a vast ocean of similarities, it also didn't seem to consider the possibility that the differences that were observed in brain connectivity may have been a function of it just making sense for differently sized brains to solve the problem of wiring in slightly different kinds of ways. And in fact, a later study reported that differences in connectivity were explained by brain size, not sex. In other words, smaller brains, whether belonging to males or females, tend to be somewhat differently connected than larger ones. So the question to ask here is the difference that's being reported being considered in isolation or in the context of other relevant characteristics that might cancel out or compensate? Now moving on to the sixth question, what does a brain difference actually mean? And you can see this is a bit that gets people kind of excited and occasionally carried away, and you can see how many questions that you have to ask before you can even get to this question. Now this is extremely fertile ground for myth making. Some good examples come from the kind of wild extensions of the claim made in the Shaywitz study, which you'll remember from the beginning of the talk, this idea of lateralization. So this general notion of the female brain being more interconnected while the male brain is more localized has led to all kinds of creative ideas, including this explains why men find it difficult to talk about their feelings and to remember to pick up milk. So some interesting examples here. And moving from popularizers to scientists, the claim that men's brains are more locally connected has been presented as the neural basis of men's superiority in maths and physics. Now the problem here is that different parts of the brain don't neatly map onto different functions, meaning that neuroscientists can't currently take a brain imaging readout or information about the size or other features of a brain region or interconnectivity, and in the absence of any other information, reliably say what kind of mental activity or characteristics are to be expected on the basis of those structural or functional characteristics. And as we've seen, individuals can take different neural roads to the same behavioural end. All of this helps to explain why even neuroscientists who work with non-human animals under controlled conditions have trouble linking female-male differences in brain structure to behavioural differences. So as a consequence, speculations about the behavioural significance of sex differences in the human brain can owe more to gender stereotypes than to scientific models. So a good illustration of this is that while as mentioned, some scientists claim that a locally connected brain is superior for physics, scientists who studied Albert Einstein's brain suggested that his genius in maths and physics was actually underpinned by his unusually interconnected brain. So a very basic question to ask about claims about what sex differences in the brain mean is, if you reverse the explanation, would it be just as plausible? And last but not least, we'll move on to the grand sweep of evolutionary explanations of sex differences. Here's just one fun example. Now, tempting though it may be to assume otherwise, many aspects of contemporary human conditions are not adaptations, they're not for anything. And it's also important to check even apparently very plausible evolutionary explanations of sex differences against the available evidence. For example, despite common understanding that aggression was the key to male success in our ancestral past, there's no clear-cut relation between male aggression and reproductive success in primate societies or in humans. Along similar lines, in mammals, there are actually clearer associations between rank in a dominance hierarchy and fitness consequences in females than in males. And also, strange though it may seem, evolved doesn't necessarily mean inherited via genes. Modern evolutionary thinking includes an important role for non-genetic factors, including environmental factors, in both the development and cross-generation transfer of evolved traits. For example, it turns out that if you foster a newborn male sheep with a goat, or vice versa, then those lambs and kids will develop a robust and persistent sexual preference for mates of the cross-fostered species. This shows that a social environment that includes one's own species plays a critical role in the development of same-species sexual preference, and in the normal course of things, the inheritance of that sexual preference from generation to generation. In this example, whatever genetically inherited contribution there is to a highly adaptive sexual preference for the same species, it is the environmental inheritance that holds sway over the development of the behaviour. Now, the traditional and still common assumption is that sexually selected behavioural traits are always inherited via the direct effects of sex-related genes and hormones on the brain. This brings us back to this figure that I showed you before. Remember these direct effects. However, there's now growing interest in what may be called environmental inheritance of sex-linked behaviour. So this refers to situations we met before in the discussion of indirect effects of sex, in which biological sex creates a tangible difference between the sexes, such as in size, appearance, or smell, which in turn has a reliable effect on the individual's developmental experiences. This sex-specific environmental experience can potentially be partly or fully responsible for the reproduction of the sex difference in behaviour generation after generation. Now in humans, of course, we call this gender socialisation, but as we've already seen, this unexpectedly convoluted pathway has also been seen in non-human animals. And if you're interested in this idea, this article with John Dupre and Daphne Ewell in Trends in Cognitive Sciences spells it out in much more detail. So final questions to ask if the findings are being put in an evolutionary context. Has the researcher provided evidence that the gendered behaviour enhanced reproductive success in environments thought to be similar to those in which selection occurred? Have the researchers provided evidence that the behaviour is inherited genetically? Have they considered other transfer mechanisms, including behavioural or cultural mechanisms? And I'd like to finish with one kind of final issue that can often cast a shadow over debate and discussion in this area. And this is the idea that being concerned about or pointing out these kinds of issues regarding what you can see as a very complex area of science is a sign that someone has a blank slate view of development and evolution, is driven by political ideology, or thinks that political equality between the sexes depends on the sexes being identical or more or less the same. This really isn't about political correctness, it's about scientific correctness. So again, I recommend, if you're interested, to take a look at the original paper on which this podcast is based. And of course, if you're interested to read more on the topic, there are a number of books by myself, by Gina Rippon and Daphne Ewell. Enjoy exploring a fascinating subject, and thank you for your attention.